celebrating our 20th season. From the college by the lake, meeting the personalities and discussing the issues that affect all of Coeur d'Alene and the inland Northwest. We are the North Idaho College Public Forum. And now, here's your host and moderator, political scientist Tony Stewart.
One of our favorite subjects on this program is dealing with what I would call travelogues, and we're very fortunate to be able to cover that subject once again. And it's such a delight to welcome to a good friend of mine and a colleague at North Idaho College on the program to discuss her recent trip to France. I welcome to the program Judith Brower, who is in the Department of Mathematics. She's also a nun in the Roman Catholic Church. Recently, during our spring break, she went to France for that week. Her brother lives in France, and she had that advantage of being with someone who has lived there a long time and could see the country in a much different light and in much more detail than a tourist would. And Judith, it's so a pleasure to have you on the program and to discuss your recent trip to France.
Thanks, Tony. I appreciate it.
And I'm very happy to have back Lloyd Marsh, who's with us from time to time on the panel, and he's always so informative. And Mr. Marsh is on the faculty at North Idaho College and is also one of my friends and colleagues, and he is in the Physical Sciences Division. And I would like to ask Lloyd to commence the questioning.
Well, I think if we're going to satisfy our viewers, maybe you could give us just a little overview. Going to France, France is a relatively large country, so can you take us on a little overview of the trip? Where did you start and where did you end up in France?
Okay, actually, Lloyd and Tony, I went to a very limited area of France because my brother lives in a suburb of Paris, probably as far from Paris as Post Falls is from Spokane, about a 45-minute commute by car. So what we basically did, since he was finishing up his basketball season, was try to stay pretty close to home. So we spent 2 days off and on in Paris itself, and then we took a trip to Chartres, a famous medieval town, which is about 50 miles away from Paris to the west, and then spent some time at Versailles. And then I also spent some time just in a couple of the small towns, also to the northwest of Paris, a little town called Poissy, a little town of 40,000 people, in which my brother's basketball team is located, where he coaches, and the little town of Triel-sur-Seine, which is where he lives, and is also right now a bedroom community of Paris, but is a 9th century French village.
Wonderful. Wonderful.
There's so many things to ask when you go and you visit with people. And Judith, you're a very extroverted person, so I know you talk to a lot of people. And being in the field
all of three, yes.
being in the field of political science, I always have some questions in that area. I would just like for you to take a little time to tell us what were some of the discussions. I know that there have been some elections taking place in France, and according to the news accounts that we have, the socialist forces in France are in trouble, and in fact there's even an increase we hear in the political votes of the far right. Would you tell us what the French people are saying and how they're behaving politically?
Sure. At least from my limited perspective, I think the French people are feeling a bit overwhelmed, and we in the United States don't quite understand that. France is about 1/17 the size of the United States, with a population of about 1/5 or 1/4 of the United States. So they're quite a bit more densely populated. And to the east, they're bordered by Germany, Switzerland, Italy, which puts them very close to Hungary, Romania, and to the people of the former East German Republic. They have been inundated by them, as well as inundated by French citizens from former colonies in North Africa. And the French government immediately, when people immigrate to their country, provide sufficient amount of money and resources in the area of social welfare to allow these people not simply to do subsistence living, but to have some sense of quality of life. They're poor, but they're not poor in the same sense that some of the welfare folks in the United States struggle with. So I think the burden, as well over 1 million people have immigrated to France in the last 2 or 3 years, the burden the French people are bearing seems to many of them to be, haven't we done enough? Especially when they see countries like the United States saying in a very restrictive fashion towards immigration. No, we can't take anyone. So I really think that these statements are not as much statements that people would like to espouse a far-right form of government, but rather are saying to a socialist or basically a pro-socialist form of economic structure, we think maybe we have done enough, or we have to look at what we can do.
So that frustration is registered against whatever government happens to be in power that's bringing those policies, and secondly, that the fact that the socialist platform is more likely to involve government programs,
Yes.
that's explaining some of the anti-government vote.
I think people are just feeling caught in the same sort of economic bind that many folks in the U.S. find themselves. There's not an abundance of dollars in France either. And they're saying, how about people who have lived here, or families who have lived here for 100, 200, 500 years, and we find unemployment here? Or we find people who have been French citizens in North Africa. What's striking is that in France there's not nearly as much of a division on color of folks' skin as there is on language that people speak with fluency. And so if someone speaks French fluently and is a French citizen, the color of their skin is barely recognizable. However, when folks are moving in from Romania, Hungary, Albania, Czechoslovakia, East Germany, and that is not the culture with which they've been raised, people are finding themselves resenting that.
I have a second question, and I know Lloyd has some questions and some photographs you brought that we're delighted that you brought with you. Over the years, we've heard about times when there's really a very anti-American attitude in France. Other times it's been much more during the Charles de Gaulle period, when he was trying to bring back the identity of France. Of course, that was very high, and he encouraged that. What is the attitude at this time?
Well, you'll partly hear my biased view. My sister-in-law is French. My brother is a U.S. citizen. So I tend to hear a little bit of both. Basically, I find the French people very welcoming, very warm, and very willing to discuss the politics and the basically social style of the United States. I don't think there's a strong pro or con stance on the part of a general populace. You'll certainly get that from individuals. However, I do think there is a strong resentment on the part of the French that the U.S. sometimes comes across with a "we shall solve all of your problems if you do it our way," or with a U.S. Messiah complex. And partly I feel that's the case because France herself has lived through a 17th and 18th century period of time in which she was the mistress of the earth. French is the language and was the language of diplomacy, of negotiations, and many of the French who lived surrounded by the glories of 500 to 1,000 years ago see themselves still as having lived with history, and the United States often is very disrespectful of the lessons history can learn, or if not outright disrespectful, at least oblivious of the lessons we might learn.
Thank you. Lloyd?
Well, maybe taking just a little different tack and yet related, you said that people have lived in Paris, have generations upon generations, and they're so much older country than we are. Maybe we can take a little walk around Paris with you, and if we could have some of those photographs, maybe you can comment on them, and we'll take a look at the first photograph. Well, you describe it. You took it.
Well, this is a winter scene at Versailles. Versailles, my brother and I spent part of an afternoon walking around Louis XIV's second home when he outgrew his first home of a few hundred rooms. And French was in her glory in the 17th century. He built the chateau, the palace at Versailles. This one little fountain is probably one of, I would estimate, maybe 150 to 200 fountains on the grounds. And during the time we walked around, we may have seen a fifth of the grounds, not begun to walk over them. You'll notice in the foreground there's a pipe running into the fountain itself. That would not be visible when the tourist season was in its high time. While we were there, trees were being uprooted and replanted, and pavements were being redone, fountains were being cleaned, figures were removed from fountains and cleaned. But this beautiful palace of Versailles, which sits quite on the southwest edge of Paris, very much part of a city, and Versailles right now in the city that surrounds it is a delightful place to live and one of the borderline affordable places for middle class to upper middle class folks to live. It's just a delight.
Yes, yes, and certainly, you're originally from Chicago, and there is some difference between Paris and Chicago.
There's a tad. There's a tad. But I think anyone who has walked through the major parks of large cities will have seen the imitation that we in the United States, the compliment we pay to places like Versailles by the grounds that we try to cultivate. Having grown up with Grant Park in Chicago in my eyesight, oftentimes I can admire the carefully sculpted gardens that surround the brilliant multi-storied buildings that the folks in Chicago or the people who built Central Park in New York or those who have built, what is it in San Francisco? Golden Gate Park.
Yeah.
We need to identify
strive
this
for.
one too.
We're still in Versailles.
Yes.
And we are approaching one of the wings. I rather think we're coming to the Galerie des Glaces, walking up towards this marvelous second-story reception area of mirrors, a hall of mirrors. And as we walk through Versailles, we'll see many of these cone-shaped, trimmed spruce trees, the carefully cultivated gardens. We can't look over the bushes. And the flowers are not in bloom on these pictures because it was March, but it was a delightful day, and regardless of the springness of it rather than full summer or autumn, the beauty of simply the geometric shape, the appreciation for pattern, for repetition yet for contrast is evident as you walk around the grounds.
And of course, the French have a great deal of nationalistic pride, don't they?
None at all.
Not at all.
None at all, yes.
I think we're probably looking at another view in Paris. Maybe you could describe this.
Okay. Actually, to the left of us, about, it would be the equivalent of half a block for us, is the Cathedral of Notre Dame. And we are in the Place in front of Notre Dame. Notre Dame is situated on an island in the middle of the Seine River, between the left and right banks as we know them. It's the oldest part of the city. It's where the original 3rd and 5th century dwellers would do their little holding up of vessels sailing up the river and collect tolls. And the gendarmes, the policemen who are in the Place, are actually standing over an archaeological site. At this particular place, Paris has been preserved to the outside view, but underneath this Place, somewhere like 30 to 50 feet below, an archaeological expedition is going on where the 3rd century Gallic village and the 5th century Merovingian village are being excavated with the remains kept in a carefully constructed museum of excavation in a crypt right near the Cathédrale de Notre Dame.
And of course, in France, I think one of the things that you note as you walk around the city and in the vicinity of Paris is the tremendous influence that the church, the Catholic Church, as a matter of fact, had in France. I see another view, and this has one of the typical landmarks. Maybe you could describe this for us.
Okay. Actually, this little scene would be viewed on a postcard if it were blue sky and called Les Toits de Paris, the roofs of Paris. The old marketplace called Les Halles, the stomach of Paris, where you would go to get your milk and your meat each day, has been torn down and replaced by the new Georges Pompidou Centre de Culture. It's a new contemporary 20th century art cultural museum and about 5 floors of anything else one might want. But around the outside of these 5 stories is an escalator that takes you up and views over the entire scene. We were looking at Le Tour Eiffel, better known to us as the Eiffel Tower. It's a wonderful panoramic view, even to the point where you get up to the 5th floor and you walk out onto an open-air stairway. No U.S. obsession with safety, someone might jump over the thing. You just walk out the door, and there you are, standing out in the open air 5 floors up, free to take pictures or walk around to wherever.
Marvelous. And I understand that you did some traveling outside of the city of Paris. And this looks like, with the wheat field, it wouldn't be downtown Paris. It's got to be somewhere else. Maybe you could describe this for us.
You bet. As one drives from central France near Orléans to the Normandy coast, one drives along one of the autoroutes. And so west of Paris, about 50 miles, you come to the medieval town of Chartres. The Cathedral of Chartres is probably its most noted feature. It is the classic example of the Gothic cathedral. Shows marvelously the transition from the Romanesque period of architecture to the beginnings of the Gothic. The area around here is very flat. You'd think you were on the Rathdrum Prairie. And wheat is very much cultivated. And you drive along, and suddenly, over the horizon, just like the Rocky Mountains pop out in Montana, the Cathedral of Chartres rises up, and the spires stay with you as you drive around it. Now, my sister-in-law is from Normandy, and my brother said as he had driven along the autoroute many times between Orléans, where he had played, and Normandy, he'd gone past this scene, but never stopped in until we went, and it was absolutely a culture shock for him.
Wow, I can imagine. And I think there is another close-up view, if we could have that, of, maybe we're not going to get it. Ah, there we go.
Okay.
This is in the locale of Chartres.
Okay, I mentioned that where the policemen were standing in front of Notre Dame, an excavation was going on underneath the concrete. At Chartres, they didn't bother with the niceties of keeping the place, the concrete, and it's roughly the same kind of setting. They are excavating again a 3rd century Gallic village that was located on the site of where the Cathedral of Chartres is now. So this would be the open-air courtyard immediately in front of the cathedral. As you walk to it now, you walk past the metal fence protecting you from this excavation area. But they're literally taking apart bucketful by bucketful of dirt and looking to preserve, do this careful caring for history that they will do.
I think one of the things that you have been so eloquent in presenting is how the people in Europe are so astute as to their history and their preservation, and maybe that because they have a much older history than our own country. Something else that I always try to do on these shows, that when we have a visitor like you and traveling, and Lloyd Marsh can certainly participate in this. We have not told our audience that he's a real veteran because he goes to France every year. His mother lives in France, and so it was so great to have him on the program today too. But when individuals are traveling, I know we get correspondence ahead of time saying, give us some tips when we get there. So I'd like for you to take this opportunity to tell our viewers who might be considering going to France what is happening there now in relation. Again, we tape this in March 1992, and it will be some weeks before it airs, but what are the prices like as far as food and hotel, and what are some of the sites to visit, or some of the social life experiences that one should taste while in France?
Okay. First, one is just a simple little precaution. I think we forget, living in the Northwest, at least I did, about the security measures under which a goodly part of the world lives. And certainly coming into and especially leaving Charles de Gaulle Airport, I was much more aware of the very serious nature of how one packs and what kinds of questions one is going to be asked by security agents. Also, when you go into a large department store.
May I interrupt just to say, what are some of the things that you should not pack that could cause security problems?
Well, don't forget anything that has batteries in it. You can pack it, but don't forget to tell them.
Okay.
Anything that might look like a weapon. Don't forget to tell them that it's there. Make very sure luggage tags match with your passport, and that your ticket name is not something different than it might be on your passport. Don't use nicknames. And don't be flip with the security people. They face at least one bomb a week at Charles de Gaulle Airport, or threat of it. And so it's a very real thing for them.
I'm sorry, you were going to some of the stores, but I just want to get that in.
And it's sort of along the same nature. If you walk into anything other than a mom and pop shop, there will be armed guards with weapons that are mostly visible, and with walkie-talkies at every exit. So that is for certainly the type of security of a bomb nature. Okay. But to get to a more pleasant thing, because that's simply something that's a fact of life when you live at a crossroads of the world. especially with the turmoil that's at rest in North Africa, the Middle East, and Europe. What I enjoyed watching was especially food prices, okay, because food is a totally different part of life than for most of us in the States. My mother was recently in France, and for her, a meal is something that one does to get food in, and you enjoy it. You want to have it with people that you do. But it is not a way to celebrate life, for the most part. That's saved for special occasions. Well, I think it would be fair to say that for most French families, every main meal, whether it's at noon or 9 at night, is a celebration of life. And so you're going to have breads with brie cheese and camembert and a good wine, not a real expensive one, but to us what might be very fine is going to be ordinary table wine. And those things like bread and cheese and mushrooms and wine are going to be very reasonably priced, probably a little cheaper than they might be in the States. But anything like meat or specially grown vegetables or out-of-season fruit are going to be quite expensive. That doesn't mean the French won't choose to have them, but because the meal is a celebration and will go on for an hour and a half to 2 or 2.5 hours every day. So it's also a part of your entertainment, of your family structure. But a roast of beef, that would be probably equivalent to us to a sirloin tip roast, was priced on sale at 99 francs for a kilo, which breaks out roughly to about $9 a pound. So we're probably not going to serve 8-ounce servings, at least not real often. Mass transportation is wonderfully affordable. Gasoline is prohibitively expensive, even though we don't have the distances. The distances there are not what we would face. Because within 100 miles from my brother's home, you could be quite close to the Netherlands, to Luxembourg, Belgium, to Austria, to certainly to eastern France, and so your mileage is going to be a whole lot better. But gas breaks out to something like $3.50 to $4 a gallon for gasoline.
So they're in effect they're asking people to use mass transportation. Can you talk a little bit about traveling on mass transportation in Paris, the metro? And,
well, the metro is a delight. It's very easy to get around in. In every metro station, there is a giant map of the metro station. You push a button for where you want to go of the typical tourist sites, and your route lights up, and it tells you where to change trains to another train. We went from the center of the city to the far north in roughly 5 to 6 minutes of train riding time and probably 8 to 10 minutes of walking to get from one connection. Because in every station there are connections to 4 or 5 other stations, but you follow all the signs that say where to go. A book of metro tickets for 10 cost us 35 francs, which was about $6.50. It's 10 rides. Anytime you don't come up to the surface, you keep using the same ticket. So if you get off the train and go out and see the sights and go back down, you use another one. But to transfer a couple of times, you just keep going. So we spent a book of tickets for 2 of us, seeing about, roughly a third of the city of Paris. So for $6, 2 people covered Paris in an afternoon, or in a morning and an afternoon, my sister-in-law and I.
and during this whirlwind tour of Paris, what was perhaps the most impressive place that you went to?
Well, let's see. Well, impressive place for me would probably be Notre Dame, simply because of the immensity of it, yet the wonderful soaring nature of the construction. It's big, but yet you're surrounded by beauty. My spirits feel lifted. It's quiet. People treat it with reverence and respect. It's not just a place one goes to tour. And also sitting with the history with which one sits there, that church has been on that site off and on, or more or less, for 900 years. And I can't even imagine 90 years, much less 900 years.
That's right.
So I did tend to see a number of churches. was sort of into churches this time.
That's one reason why I introduced the program with your background as it is, because I know that was a very exciting thing for you to do. There are a number of very special events and in the arts and the humanities and in sports and all these things while you're there. I kindly suspect that you might want to show this tape to your brother, and I would certainly not want to get you in trouble. I know that you indicated he was a basketball coach. Tell us a little bit about his team and how basketball works and what are the other sports and events in France.
Okay. See, basketball is a growing sport of interest in Europe. It resembles soccer in its speed and the agility that's required to handle the ball and the teamwork, even though most of us wouldn't have thought of that. So my brother went to Europe with his identical twin in 1974 and has played basically at a number of teams around France and a little bit in Belgium since that time. And the last 4 or 5 years has been a player coach. In French basketball, and I'm not sure I'll get it all straight, but there are a number of divisions. There's National 1A, from which their Olympic team will probably be drawn, 1B, and then National 2, 3, I believe 4, and then I think there are some provincial teams, at which teams will only play in a certain regional area. Bob's team this year, the team of Poissy, was playing in National 2. I think they played something like a 25-game season, generally 1 game a week. I was very impressed with the rigor of their practice, with the licensing procedure their coaching staff must maintain, that's certified by the state and by their peers. Much to the contrary of what our professional sports demands. Bob's team finished first in their half of National 2. I think there are something like 16 teams in one pool and 16 teams in another pool at that National 2. The top teams in each division move up to the next level throughout French basketball, and the bottom teams of one division will move down in an effort to maintain some sense of quality of competition. So next year, Bob's team, because they finished first, will be moving to National 1B and competing on a much more intensive level. I think I would estimate National 2, where he's competing now, at probably a caliber of ball played by the teams playing in the best teams playing in the NIT tournament. Probably those that will qualify for the final rounds of that. Or some of the teams certainly in the NCAA. As a matter of fact, one of NIC's quote alumni, Patrick Plantier, from who has played some ball here at NIC, is now playing in a National 1 team, I believe, in Paris, and pulling down a little more as a salary than he had as laundry money here at NIC.
We've just run out of time, but just one final note is that also in their sports, a lot of those are teams that are outside of their school system. They do a lot of separating from whereas we integrate into the school system. Well, Judith, on behalf of Lloyd and our staff, I want to thank you so much. It's been absolutely an exciting program with you, and you articulated so well your trip, and I know others will want to go to France just because of what you have had to say. Thank you again for taking time to be with us.
You're welcome, Tony.
Ladies and gentlemen, I know you've enjoyed our program. Judith, is always very exciting to deal with any topic, and we'd like to invite you to be with us again next week at the same time when we will discuss another very important subject. Until then, please have a good week. I am Tony Stewart.
The North Idaho College Public Forum was videotaped live from the studios of Telemedia Services on the campus of North Idaho College for viewing at this more appropriate time. We invite you to join us again next week for another all-new edition of the North Idaho College Public Forum on this public television station.